If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and this happened to me in the winter of 1962. I don't expect you to believe everything I am about to tell you. Sometimes I have trouble believing it myself. But every word is true, and I need to share what I saw in Yellowstone that winter, even if it's just to warn others. I was a park ranger back then, stationed at one of the most remote outposts in Yellowstone National Park. It was just me, my German Shepherd Scout, and occasionally my partner Mark in that tiny cabin, surrounded by nothing but snow, steam vents, and silence. 30 miles of wilderness separated us from the nearest town, and trust me, in a Wyoming winter, 30 miles might as well be 300. That winter was different from any I'd seen before, and I'd seen plenty. The temperature dropped so low the thermometer outside my cabin just gave up, stuck at -45. Even the old-timers in the area said they'd never seen anything like it. The cold was alive somehow, like it had teeth and claws that could tear right through your thickest coat. I guess I should mention that before all this, I was a Marine in Korea. That's important because what I saw in Yellowstone, well, let's just say it made Korea look like a walk in the park. I also lost my wife, Sarah, to cancer 2 years before all this started. The only thing I had left of her was this silver locket she always wore. I kept it in my pocket like a good luck charm, though I wasn't feeling particularly lucky that winter. The day everything started, I was doing my usual patrol. Scout was with me, and the morning was quiet, too quiet. You know how people say that? It was too quiet? Well, in Yellowstone, quiet isn't normal. There should be birds, wind in the trees, something. But that morning, it was like someone had put the whole world on mute. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another ice formation. We got lots of those around the hot springs. But as I got closer, I realized what I was looking at, and my blood turned just as cold as the air around me. Standing there, perfectly upright in the snow, was a frozen body. Not just frozen like someone who died from the cold, but frozen like a statue, perfectly preserved. The man's face was locked in a scream, but the strangest part? His eyes. They had no ice crystals in them. Anyone who's worked search and rescue in the cold knows that's not possible. Scout, who'd faced down angry bears with me before, took one look at that frozen man and tucked his tail between his legs. He started whining, not his usual something's wrong whine, but a sound I'd never heard him make before. Like he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. That's how it all began. I didn't know it then, but that frozen body was just the first sign of something much worse. Something that had been waiting in the steam and ice of Yellowstone, maybe for hundreds of years, waiting for a winter cold enough to wake it up. And now it was awake, and it was hungry. I radioed back to the station to report what I'd found. The radio crackled with static. It always did around the hot springs, but I managed to get through to Mark, my partner. "I've never seen anything like this, Mark," I said, walking around the frozen figure. "It's like he was flash frozen standing up. That's not how people usually freeze to death." "Take pictures and mark the location," Mark replied through the static. "I'll head your way. Should be there in about an hour." I pulled out my camera and started taking photos, but my hands were shaking. Not from the cold. I was used to that. Something about this whole scene felt wrong. The steam vents nearby were acting strange too. Usually they followed a pattern, puffing out steam every few minutes. But now they were going crazy, sending out clouds of white mist that seemed to crawl along the ground instead of rising up. Scout wouldn't leave my side. He kept pressing against my leg, something he only did when he sensed danger. I reached down to pat his head, trying to calm him down, but honestly, I needed the comfort more than he did. That's when I noticed something else. Around the frozen man's feet, there were these weird ice crystals growing up from the ground. Not normal ice, these looked almost alive, spreading out like frozen fingers reaching for his boots. I'd worked in Yellowstone for years, but I'd never seen ice form like that. I pulled out my notebook to write down what I was seeing, and my wife's locket fell out of my pocket into the snow. When I picked it up, it was weirdly warm to the touch, despite lying in snow that was well below zero. I thought that was strange, but I had bigger things to worry about. While waiting for Mark, I decided to look around the area. The tracks leading to where the man stood just stopped, like he had walked to that spot and never took another step. In this deep snow, that made no sense. There should have been signs of a struggle, or at least footprints leading away. Then I found something that made my stomach turn. Hidden behind a rock formation, there was a small cave entrance. Inside, scratched into the wall, were these old markings, Native American pictographs. I'd seen plenty of these around Yellowstone, but these were different. They showed human figures running from what looked like white shapes in the steam. Below them was a warning symbol I recognized from my talks with the local tribes. The sound of crunching snow told me Mark was getting close. Scout's ears perked up, but he was still tense. I should have been relieved that help was coming, but instead, I felt this growing sense of dread, like we were being watched by something that lived in the steam and ice around us. I just didn't know yet how right I was. Mark arrived bundled up in his heavy winter gear, his breath making clouds in the freezing air. He took one look at the frozen man and pulled off his glove to touch the ice. He yanked his hand back immediately. "Tom, this ice. It's colder than any ice I've ever felt," he said, rubbing his fingers. "That shouldn't be possible. Ice is ice." I was about to answer when Scout started growling. Not his usual warning growl, but something deeper, more frightened. The steam from the vents was getting thicker, swirling around our feet in a way that didn't look natural. It reminded me of how fog rolls over water, except this fog seemed to be moving with purpose. "We need to get this body back to the station," Mark said, but his voice shook a little. "Something's not right here." That's when we heard it, a sound like cracking glass, but much louder. About 50 yards away, through the steam, we saw another figure standing perfectly still. My heart nearly stopped. It was another frozen victim, a young woman in hiking gear, her arms raised like she was trying to protect herself from something. "That wasn't there 5 minutes ago," I whispered. "Mark, I've been watching that area. There was nothing there." The steam was getting thicker now, and the temperature was dropping even lower. My thermometer read -50, colder than I'd ever seen in Yellowstone. Scout was pressing against my leg so hard I could barely stand. Then Mark pointed to something that made my blood run cold. Between us and the second victim, the steam was changing. Parts of it were becoming more solid, taking shape. It looked almost human, but transparent, like it was made of ice crystals and mist. "Tom," Mark's voice was barely a whisper now. "We need to go. Now." But before we could move, we heard that cracking sound again. And again. All around us, through the steam, we could see more shapes appearing. More victims frozen in poses of terror. It was like we were suddenly standing in the middle of a garden of ice statues. The thing in the steam was getting clearer now. I could see what looked like arms, a head, but it was all wrong, like someone had tried to make a person out of frozen fog. Where its face should have been, there were just swirling patterns of ice and steam. My hand clutched Sarah's locket in my pocket, and I felt it grow warm again. The steam thing seemed to notice this and pulled back slightly. That's when I realized we might have a chance. But first, we had to get out of there alive. "Back up slowly," I whispered to Mark. "No sudden moves." We started backing away, but the steam followed us. It was like the fog had a mind of its own, reaching out with long white fingers. Scout was whimpering now, his tail tucked so far under him he looked half his normal size. Then Mark's radio crackled to life. The sound echoed in the frozen air, and the thing in the steam, it turned toward him. I've been in combat, seen things that would give most people nightmares. But the way it moved, like water flowing uphill, made my skin crawl. "The radio," Mark said, fumbling with it. "Maybe we can call for—" He never finished that sentence. The steam thing moved faster than anything I've ever seen. 1 second it was yards away, the next it was right in front of Mark. He tried to run, but the fog wrapped around him like a blanket. I heard him scream, a sound I'll never forget, and then I watched my partner freeze solid in seconds. Not like normal freezing, this was different. The ice spread over him like paint flowing across glass, starting where the steam touched him. His eyes. God help me. His eyes were still moving after the rest of him was frozen. "Mark!" I yelled, but I knew it was too late. Scout was barking now, pulling at my pants leg, trying to get me to run. The dog had more sense than I did. I turned and ran, following Scout. Behind me, I heard that cracking sound again, and I knew without looking that Mark was now just another statue in that horrible garden. The thing was following us. I could feel the temperature dropping as it got closer. We reached a cluster of hot springs, the steam rising up creating a maze of white clouds. I've walked these paths 1,000 times, but now everything looked different. The steam was moving wrong, twisting into shapes that looked almost like faces. That's when I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. In the steam, like a movie playing on a screen made of fog, I saw Sarah, my wife, exactly as she looked before she got sick. She was reaching out to me, smiling that smile I missed so much. "Tom," her voice seemed to come from everywhere. "Join us." But the locket in my pocket was burning hot now, and I knew this wasn't really Sarah. The thing was trying to trick me, using my memories against me. I clutched the locket tight and yelled something I remembered from the Native American markings in the cave, a word of protection I'd learned from the local tribes. The image of Sarah vanished, and the steam pulled back like it had been burned. I had found a weakness, but I also made it angry. Very angry. Scout and I ran toward the biggest hot spring in the area. I had an idea, a crazy one, but it was all I had. The thing in the steam was following us, and now it wasn't trying to hide anymore. It split into 3 shapes, all of them looking like people made of ice and fog surrounding us. The hot spring ahead was one of Yellowstone's biggest geysers. Usually, it erupted every few hours, sending boiling water high into the air. As we ran, I could feel the ground rumbling under my feet. An eruption was coming soon. "Come on, Scout," I panted, pulling out Sarah's locket. It was glowing now, actually glowing with a soft silver light. The steam creatures pulled back whenever it shined on them, hissing like water on a hot stove. That's when I saw what they had been building. Behind the geyser was a field of frozen people, dozens of them. Some were hikers, some were rangers I knew. All of them frozen solid, arranged like some kind of twisted art display. And in the ice beneath them, something was growing, spreading like roots through the ground. "They're not your garden," I shouted at the creatures. "They're people, real people." The middle steam thing moved forward. When it spoke, it sounded like cracking ice and winter wind. "They are our seeds," it whispered. "When spring comes, they will bloom. More will grow. All will become like us." The ground shook harder. The geyser was about to blow. I looked at all those frozen people, my friends, my partner, and knew what I had to do. The locket was burning in my hand now, hot enough to hurt. "Scout, run!" I yelled, and my brave dog finally listened, taking off towards safety. I ran straight at the nearest steam creature, holding up Sarah's locket. It shrieked, a sound like breaking icicles, and backed away. The other 2 came at me from the sides, but I kept moving toward the geyser. The ground was shaking so hard now I could barely stay on my feet. "Sarah," I whispered, clutching her locket, "help me do this right." The steam creatures were almost on me when the geyser erupted, but instead of running away, I ran toward it, holding the locket out in front of me like a shield. The boiling water shot up into the freezing air, and I threw the locket straight into the middle of it. What happened next was like nothing I've ever seen. The locket hit the boiling water just as the steam creatures reached me. There was a flash of silver light, brighter than the sun on snow. The geyser's water, instead of falling back down, started spinning in the air like a tornado made of boiling water and steam. Sarah's locket was floating in the middle of it all, glowing like a star. The steam creatures screamed. They tried to back away, but the spinning water was pulling them in. I watched as their icy bodies started to melt and break apart. The one that looked like Sarah reached for me one last time, but its arm dissolved into regular steam as soon as it touched the hot water. "Tom," it whispered in Sarah's voice, one last time. But I knew better now. "My wife is gone," I said firmly. "And those people you froze? They had families too. This ends now." The ground cracked open wider around the geyser, and more hot springs burst to life. The whole area was becoming one giant steam field. The frozen garden of people was starting to thaw as hot water flowed underneath it. I could hear the ice cracking and breaking. But I was trapped. The boiling water was everywhere now, and the cold of the creatures was fighting against it. I was caught in the middle, with freezing steam on one side and boiling water on the other. My feet were going numb, and my face felt like it was burning. That's when I heard Scout barking. He had come back with help, other rangers who had seen the steam tornado from miles away. They were trying to reach me, but I knew they couldn't get close enough. I looked at Sarah's locket one last time, still floating and glowing in the middle of it all. "I am sorry," I whispered, though I am not sure if I was talking to Sarah or to everyone I couldn't save. Then I jumped forward, grabbed the locket, and plunged it into the biggest crack in the ground, right where the geyser came from. The silver light shot down deep into the earth, and everything exploded. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Wyoming. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive. Severe frostbite on one side, burns on the other. Scout had led the rescue team to where I was lying in the snow after the explosion. They found all the frozen people too. As the ice thawed, some of them were still alive, somehow preserved by whatever the steam creatures had done to them. Not everyone made it, including Mark, but we saved more than I thought possible. The official report said it was a rare geological event. Multiple geysers erupting at once, combined with extreme cold weather conditions. Nobody would believe the truth anyway. I still work as a ranger, but not in Yellowstone. Scout and I moved to a warmer park in Arizona. I keep Sarah's locket in a box now. It's just a normal silver locket again, not glowing anymore. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I think I hear something in it, like ice cracking in the distance. Because I know the truth. The steam creatures weren't destroyed that day, just scattered. Somewhere in Yellowstone, in the deepest hot springs where the park rangers don't go, ice is still forming in impossible ways. And on the coldest nights of winter, if you listen carefully, you might hear whispers in the white. My name is Maria Delgado, and this happened to me in the fall of 1977. I need to write it all down now, while I still can, while I still have enough of myself left to tell the story. Most people won't believe what I am about to share, but every word of it is true. I know because I lived it. I survived it. Well, most of me did. I was a park ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky back then. Not just any ranger. I was the one people called when things went wrong underground. I knew those caves better than anyone. Mapped more of them than any other person alive. When visitors got lost or hurt down there in the darkness, I was the one who brought them back. At least, that's what I used to do. Before everything changed. Before I learned what really lives in the deep places of the earth. I should probably mention that I wasn't in a great place myself back then. My marriage had fallen apart 2 years earlier, and I hadn't spoken to my family in ages. They didn't understand why I spent so much time in the caves. Truth is, I was running away from my problems. Had just gotten my 6-month sobriety chip too. No small feat when you are trying to forget things you can't face. But the caves, they were different. Underground, in the cool darkness, everything made sense. Every tunnel led somewhere. Every problem had a solution. If you got lost, you just had to keep your head and follow the right signs. At least, That's what I used to believe. It all started when I got a call about an abandoned research camp deep in the cave system, 300 feet below the surface, in one of the newer sections we'd just started exploring. A group of scientists had been studying some unusual rock formations down there. They'd been sending regular radio updates to the surface. Then suddenly, nothing. Complete silence. I still remember taking that first elevator ride down. The way the air got cooler and damper as we descended. The familiar smell of limestone and wet earth that usually calmed my nerves. But this time was different. This time, something felt wrong. Really wrong. When we reached the base camp, I knew right away something terrible had happened. Equipment was scattered everywhere, like someone had thrown it around in a panic. Half-eaten meals were still sitting on plates, now covered in mold. Sleeping bags were torn open, their stuffing spread across the cave floor. But it was the walls that really got to me. Someone, or something, had carved strange symbols into the rock. Not like the usual graffiti we sometimes found from vandals. These were different, older somehow. They seemed to writhe and shift in the beam of my flashlight, like they were trying to tell me something I didn't want to know. That's when I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from inside the walls, like something was moving through the rock itself. I told myself it was just water dripping, or bats, or any of the normal cave sounds I'd heard 1,000 times before. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Deep down, I knew we'd stumbled onto something that was never meant to be found. Then we found the video camera. The small red light was still blinking, which meant it had power. My hands were shaking a little as I picked it up and opened the tiny screen. I didn't want to watch it, but I knew I had to. What I saw still haunts my dreams. The video started normally enough. Dr. Sarah Chen, the team leader, was talking about some weird rocks they'd found. She was excited, saying how the formations seemed to change position between their visits. Behind her, 2 other researchers were taking measurements of the cave wall. Then the camera started picking up sounds. At first, they were so quiet you could barely hear them, like someone tapping on pipes far away. But they got louder, and stranger. They didn't sound like any cave noises I'd ever heard before. They were almost like voices, but not quite human. The video got shaky after that. Lots of running, screaming, flashlight beams bouncing off wet cave walls. Then Dr. Chen was back on camera, her face white with fear. She was whispering, trying not to be heard by something. "They're in the walls," she kept saying. "They're coming through the walls. Don't let them take you. Don't let them—" The video cut off there. I gathered a rescue team the next morning. 4 of our best people. Mike Torres, our medical officer. Jenny Phillips, who knew more about cave biology than anyone else in the state. Tom Jackson, our gear expert. And Dave Chen, Dr. Chen's brother, who insisted on coming along. We packed enough supplies for a week underground. Extra batteries, medical kits, emergency rations, backup radios, everything we might need. But nothing could have prepared us for what we found down there. The first warning sign came when Jenny found the bones. They were scattered near one of the narrow passages, just little fragments at first. But something was wrong with them. The marks on them didn't look like animal teeth. They were too precise, almost surgical, and they were fresh. Then we found Marcus, one of the missing researchers. He was alive, technically. But something had happened to him. Something impossible. He was conscious, breathing, but so many of his bones were just gone. Removed somehow, through tiny holes in his skin that had healed over. He couldn't move or speak, but his eyes followed us, begging for help. That's when Dave found the cave paintings. Except they weren't paintings at all. They were warnings, hundreds of them, maybe thousands of years old, showing the same things over and over. Stick figures of people running from shadows, strange, twisted shapes that could bend in impossible ways. And always, always the same message. They hunger for what's inside. We should have turned back then. We should have gotten Marcus out and sealed off the whole section of cave. But we didn't. We had to find the others. We had to know what did this. That's when the walls started whispering our names. At first, we thought it was just echoes playing tricks on us. Caves can do that, make water drips sound like footsteps, or wind sound like whispers. But these were different. These whispers knew things. Private things. They called out to Tom about his little daughter, Katie. They knew about Jenny's fear of spiders. They even knew about my drinking problem. We tried to stick together, but the tunnels kept getting narrower. Some parts were so tight we had to crawl through one at a time. That's how we lost Tom. He was bringing up the rear, squeezing through a tight spot we called a squeeze hole, when we heard him scream. By the time we got back to him, there was just his flashlight on the ground, still shining. The hole he'd been crawling through now looked impossibly small, like it had somehow shrunk. No human could have fit through it. But we heard him calling for help, his voice echoing from deeper in the cave. "I am stuck. Please, someone help me." It sounded exactly like Tom. Dave started moving toward the voice, but Jenny grabbed his arm. "That's not Tom," she whispered. "Look at the squeeze hole. Nothing could have dragged him through that." She was right, but that didn't make it any easier to listen to Tom's voice begging us to help him, getting more desperate by the minute. We pushed on, trying to ignore the voices that kept getting closer and more real. Then we found it, a huge underground room that wasn't on any of our maps. The ceiling was so high our lights couldn't reach it, and the walls were covered in holes, hundreds of holes, all different sizes. Some as small as my fist, others big enough to walk through. That's when Jenny's light caught something moving on the ceiling. It was like a person, but wrong in every way. Its arms and legs were too long, too bendy, like they had extra joints. Its skin was pale as milk and stretched too tight over its bones. And its face, where its eyes should have been, there were just smooth patches of skin. But somehow, I knew it could see us. More of them started emerging from the holes in the walls. They moved like spiders, crawling on all fours across the rock like gravity didn't matter. They didn't make any noise. They didn't need to. They could see us with their whole bodies, using sounds we couldn't hear. "Don't move," I whispered. But Mike panicked. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the chamber. The creatures' heads all snapped toward the sound at exactly the same moment. What happened next happened so fast I still have trouble believing it. One of them just unfolded itself, joints bending in ways that bones shouldn't allow. It squeezed through a hole no bigger than a dinner plate and disappeared into the wall. We heard Mike's scream echo through the tunnels, getting further and further away. That's when we realized they weren't just living in the caves. They were living in the walls themselves. We ran. T here is no shame in admitting it. We ran as fast as we could through those dark tunnels, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly off the wet walls. But everywhere we turned, we could hear them moving inside the rock around us. They were hurting us, I realized. Like cattle being driven into a pen. They forced us deeper and deeper into the cave until we ended up in what looked like an ancient burial chamber. The walls were lined with old pottery and tools that must have been thousands of years old. And bones. So many bones. That's when we found the others, what was left of them. They weren't dead. I almost wish they had been. They were lined up against the walls, alive but hollow. Their skin was sunken in where their bones should have been. Their eyes were open, watching us, begging us. Dr. Chen was among them. Dave let out a horrible cry when he saw his sister. He ran to her, but she couldn't even turn her head to look at him. She could only move her eyes, which were filled with tears. Jenny was studying the walls, her hand shaking as she shone her light on some carvings. These markings, they're not just random drawings, they're a history. These things, they've been down here forever, living underneath us, feeding on us. The creatures started coming into the chamber then, crawling down the walls and across the ceiling. Dozens of them. They moved so smoothly, so quietly, like living shadows. One of them came forward. It was bigger than the others, and somehow I knew it was ancient, really ancient. It lifted its head and made a sound, not with its mouth, but with its whole body. A deep vibration that made my teeth hurt and my bones shake. And then, impossibly, I could understand it. The vibrations formed words in my head. "We were here first," it said. "Deep in the dark, where the sun could not burn us. We slept in the stone, grew in the stone, became part of the stone. But we need the hardness that your kind carries inside, the sweet calcium that makes you solid. We hunger for it. We have always hungered for it." "You are monsters," Dave said, his voice breaking. The creature's lipless mouth stretched into something like a smile. "We are survival," it said. "Like you, we take what we need to live. We keep our food alive, fresh. Is that not kinder than what your kind does to survive?" I was backing away, pulling Dave with me. Jenny was already at the tunnel entrance, her light searching frantically for an escape route. That's when I saw it, a narrow crack in the floor with the sound of rushing water coming from it. The underground river that ran through the lowest levels of the cave. "The water," I whispered to the others. "It's our only chance." The creatures must have sensed what we were thinking. They started moving faster, closing in from all sides. Jenny reached the crack first and disappeared into it. Dave went next. I was last, squeezing through just as one of those long, pale hands grabbed for my ankle. We fell into the darkness, into the cold rush of underground water. The current swept us away as the creature's angry vibrations shook the walls around us. But even as we were carried away by the river, I knew we hadn't escaped. Not really, because I could feel something wrong inside me, a hollow place that wasn't there before. They'd started feeding on me, just a little, just enough to plant their hunger inside me. The underground river carried us for what felt like hours before we found a place to climb out. We were cold, bruised, and terrified, but we were alive, sort of. We made it back to the surface and immediately called in every authority we could think of. The military came. Scientists came. They didn't believe us at first, until they saw the video footage from my camera that had somehow survived the river, until they found the things we brought back with us, until they saw what was happening to me. They sealed off that section of the cave with dynamite. Tons of rock came down, blocking the main tunnels to that deep chamber. They told us it was over. They told us we were safe. But I know better. Jenny died 3 months later. She walked into a cave in New Mexico and never came out. Dave disappeared while exploring a mine shaft in Colorado. I know why. I feel the same pull they did. Once the creatures touch you, once they start feeding, you belong to them. You start to understand their hunger. I can feel them spreading, through the water systems, through the deep places under our cities. Sometimes at night, I hear them whispering through the pipes in my walls, calling me, telling me to come down, to join them in the darkness. I know why I am writing this now. Tomorrow I am checking into a hospital. I am going to tell them to keep me locked up, to never let me near a cave or tunnel or even a dark basement again. Because the hollow places inside me are getting bigger. The hunger is getting stronger. I can feel my bones becoming lighter, my joints becoming looser. Sometimes when I pass a small space, a vent, a drain pipe, a narrow crack, I find myself thinking I could fit through it if I just tried, if I just let my body bend the right way. So this is my warning to you. If you are deep underground and you hear whispers that know your name, run. If you see movement in the walls that shouldn't be possible, run. And if you feel a strange hollow place growing inside you, do what I am about to do. Because they're down there, in the deep dark under your feet. They're hungry, they're patient, and they're spreading. This is my last note, my last warning. By the time you read this, I'll either be locked away forever, or I'll have become one of them. Either way, remember, stay in the light. Stay where the walls are thin and the ceilings are low. Stay where you can see the sky. Because they're always hungry. And they're coming up. Maria Delgado. The 15th of October, 1977. My name is Robert Hawkins, but everyone just calls me Bob. I've been a park ranger at Death Valley National Park for 30 years now, and what I am about to tell you happened to me last summer. I still wake up some nights, my throat dry and scratchy, tasting that red dust that almost took everything from me. I guess I should tell you a bit about myself first. I am 52 years old, and I've been raising my daughter Sarah on my own since my wife passed away 8 years ago. It hasn't been easy, but Sarah's a good kid. She's 16 now, smart as a whip and tough as desert sage. I don't talk much about my Native American heritage. My mother was Shoshone. But those old stories she used to tell me, well, they ended up meaning more than I ever thought they would. These days, my joints aren't what they used to be. Early arthritis, the doctors say. But I still do my job. I am known around here as the guy who finds lost hikers. Something about growing up in these parts gives you a sense for where scared, confused people might wander off to. At least, that's what I thought it was. Now, I am not so sure. It all started during the worst heat wave I'd ever seen hit the valley. The thermometer outside the ranger station was reading 134-day U4F by noon, and that wasn't even the worst of it. We'd been getting calls about weird dust storms appearing out of nowhere, and some of the equipment at the weather station was acting funny. Compass needles spinning wild, radio static that sounded almost like whispers. But none of that prepared me for what I found that morning when I got the call about a tour bus that had gone off the regular route. I remember checking my water bottle out of habit, adjusting my hat, and heading out in my truck, not knowing I was about to stumble into something that would change everything I thought I knew about this desert. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to the warning signs. The way the dust that morning had a reddish tint I'd never seen before. The strange symbols my flashlight caught on those rocks we'd uncovered after the last flash flood. Most of all, I wish I'd listened to that knot in my gut when I first spotted the bus through my binoculars. Sitting dead still in that valley, surrounded by swirling red dust even though there wasn't a breath of wind that day. But I didn't listen. I just did my job, like I always had. And that's how I found myself walking towards something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about reality, about history, and about what really lives out here in the endless desert. I parked my truck about 50 yards from the bus. Something felt wrong right away. It was too quiet, no voices, no engine running, not even any birds. Just complete silence. The bus sat there, covered in this weird red dust that seemed to glow a little in the morning sun. All the windows were covered with it too, so I couldn't see inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding smaller than usual in all that quiet. "Park ranger, anyone there?" Nothing, not even an echo. I walked closer, my boots crunching on the gravel. That red dust was everywhere, but there were no footprints in it except mine. Strange thing was, when I looked back, my own footprints seemed to fade away after a few seconds, like the dust was somehow alive. The bus door was open just a crack. I pulled out my flashlight, even though it was daytime, force of habit, I guess. As I got closer, I noticed something else weird. All the metal parts of the bus looked old, like they'd been sitting there rusting for years, not hours. I pulled the door open, and that's when I got my first real hint that this wasn't going to be a normal rescue. The dust inside swirled up like it was dancing, and for just a second, I swear this is true, it looked like it was trying to take the shape of a person before settling back down. Then I saw them. All 23 passengers still sitting in their seats. But they weren't. They weren't like any dead bodies I'd ever seen before. They looked like mummies, dried out and ancient, their skin dark and wrinkled like old leather. Some of them had their mouths open in silent screams. And on their exposed skin, there were these symbols, like someone had carved them there. They reminded me of the petroglyphs I'd seen in the old tribal caves, but these were fresh, still seeping. The weirdest part? According to the driver's log I found, the bus had only been missing for 3 hours. But these people, they looked like they'd been dead for centuries. I reached for my radio to call it in, but all I got was static. And in that static, I could have sworn I heard whispering, Not in English, not in any language I knew. But somehow, deep down, in the part of me that remembered my mother's stories, I felt like I understood what they were saying. They were hungry, and they weren't done yet. I backed out of the bus fast, trying to keep my breathing steady. The air felt thick, like breathing through a wet blanket. I needed help, but more than that, I needed answers. 20 years of finding lost hikers had taught me one thing: patterns matter. This wasn't the first strange thing to happen in Death Valley this summer. Back at the ranger station, I started digging through old files. My hands were shaking a bit, but I forced myself to focus. 3 hikers had disappeared last month. We found their backpacks, but the gear inside looked like it was hundreds of years old. Before that, a group of geology students reported seeing people walking in dust storms, walking towards them, but the shapes vanished when they got closer. I called my old friend Tom Running Bear. His grandfather used to be the tribal elder, and I figured if anyone knew something about this, it would be him. When I mentioned the red dust and the symbols, the phone went quiet for so long I thought we'd lost connection. "Bob," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper, "my grandfather used to tell stories about the people of the red dust. Our ancestors built special stones to keep them away. Said they were hungry spirits that could wear your body like a coat. We thought they were just stories to keep kids from wandering into dust storms." While I was talking to Tom, my daughter Sarah came into the office. She'd just finished her shift at the visitor center, and I could tell something was bothering her. She'd been organizing old photographs, and she'd found something. "Dad, look at this," she said, spreading out some old black and white photos on my desk. They were from 1872, showing an abandoned mining town called Red Valley. In one photo, you could see bodies laid out in the street. The report said they'd all been found mummified, with strange symbols carved into their skin, just like on the bus. But what really made my blood run cold was the last photo. There was a dust storm in the background, and when I looked closer, I could see shapes in it. Human shapes. Walking shapes. That's when the lights in the station flickered, and the radio on my desk crackled to life on its own. Through the static, we heard voices. They weren't speaking English, but somehow Sarah and I both understood what they were saying. "The seal is breaking. The red time is coming." Outside my office window, the sky was turning red, and in the distance, I could see dust devils forming, dozens of them, all moving against the wind, moving towards us. I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran. We made it to my truck just as the first dust devil reached the parking lot. Up close, it wasn't just dust spinning in the wind. There was something inside it, something with eyes. The dust took shape like a person, but wrong, too tall and thin. I could hear it breathing. "Dad," Sarah screamed, pointing at the station's front door. Tom had just arrived. He must have driven straight here after our call. But something was wrong. He was walking stiffly, like a puppet. When he turned to look at us, his eyes were full of red dust, and his mouth was moving, but the voice that came out wasn't his. "Join us," the thing wearing Tom's body said. "The hunger must be fed." I floored it. The truck's tires spun in the gravel as we took off down the park road. In the rearview mirror, I could see more dust devils forming, merging together into something massive. The radio kept crackling with those whispers, getting louder every minute. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "The old mining town," I said. "Those photos you found, there must be something there. Some clue about how to stop this." The drive to Red Valley usually takes an hour. We made it in 40 minutes, but it felt like forever. The dust storms were everywhere now, and twice we saw other cars stopped on the road, their drivers standing outside, staring at the sky with red dust pouring from their mouths. The old mining town was just like in the photos, except for one thing: there was a hole in the ground that wasn't there before. It looked like the recent earthquakes had opened up something, some kind of underground room. Ancient stone steps led down into the darkness. "Dad, look!" Sarah pointed at the walls of the hole. They were covered in petroglyphs, the same symbols we'd seen carved into the bus victims. But these were different somehow. They felt older, more powerful. We had no choice. The dust storms were closing in, and that hole was our only option. I turned on my flashlight, took Sarah's hand, and we started down those old steps. The air got colder as we went deeper, and the walls were covered in more symbols that seemed to glow faintly red in our flashlight beam. That's when we heard Tom's voice echo down from above. "You can't hide from the hunger." But it wasn't just Tom anymore. There were more voices, dozens of them, all speaking together. The dust was pouring down the stairs behind us like a red waterfall. At the bottom of the stairs, we found something that made us both stop dead in our tracks. It was a huge underground temple with a circle of those warning stones my mother used to talk about. And in the center of the circle was an altar, covered in the same symbols that were carved into the victims. But we weren't alone down there. The dust was still coming, and now it was starting to take shape again. This time, it wasn't just one or two figures. It was hundreds of them, all swirling together, all hungry, all reaching for us with hands made of red dust. And Sarah started coughing. "No, no, no," I said, pulling her close. Red dust was coming from her mouth now, and her eyes were starting to change. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard. "Dad," she choked out, "I can feel them. They're so hungry. They've been trapped down here for so long." I looked around desperately. The warning stones were arranged in a perfect circle around the altar, each one covered in glowing red symbols. This had to be where the original seal was made. But how? What was I supposed to do? That's when Sarah's grip on my arm got tighter. When she spoke again, it wasn't just her voice anymore. It was like 100 voices all talking at once. "The red time has returned," the voices said through my daughter's mouth. "We will feed." The dust spirits were everywhere now, swirling around us like a tornado. I could see faces in the dust, old faces, young faces, faces of everyone they'd taken over the years. They were all screaming, hungry, reaching for us. Then I remembered something my mother told me when I was little. A story about how our ancestors had trapped evil spirits. "Blood of the earth," she'd said. "Blood of the people. Blood freely given can seal away the darkness." I looked at the altar, really looked at it. There were handprints on it, ancient ones, pressed into the stone, and I understood what I had to do. "Sarah, honey," I said, "fight it. Just for a minute. Remember what Mom used to say? About how love is stronger than anything?" For just a second, I saw my daughter's real eyes look back at me. She was in there, fighting. That's all I needed to know. I pressed my hand onto the altar. The symbol underneath it began to glow bright red, and I felt something sharp cut into my palm. The stone was drinking my blood. All around us, the warning stones started humming. "I give this freely," I said, remembering the words from my mother's stories without knowing how. "Blood of the earth, blood of the people, blood of love, I seal you away." The humming got louder. The dust spirits screamed, a horrible sound like wind through 1,000 broken windows. They tried to pull away, but something was dragging them back, pulling them toward the altar. "Dad!" Sarah screamed, her real voice this time. She was on her knees, red dust pouring out of her mouth and eyes as the spirits were ripped out of her. Everything went white. There was a sound like thunder, but underground. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, Sarah was lying on the temple floor. For one horrible moment, I thought. But then she coughed and sat up. Normal cough. No red dust. My hand was still on the altar, and it hurt like crazy. There was a perfect print of my hand burned into the stone now, right next to the ancient ones. The warning stones had stopped glowing, but they felt different, stronger somehow. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was shaky, but it was her voice. Just her voice. "What happened?" "We sealed them away again," I said, wrapping my arms around her, like our ancestors did. "We found Tom at the top of the stairs, confused but alive. He didn't remember anything after our phone call. The red dust storms were gone, and the sky was back to its normal color. At the ranger station, everything looked normal too, except all our compasses still spin in circles sometimes, and late at night, when it's really quiet, you can hear whispers in the static of the radio. The bus full of tourists? The official report says it was a mass hallucination caused by heat stroke. The bodies were taken away by people in dark suits who didn't ask many questions. Within a week, it was like nothing had happened. But things did change. Sarah and I talk more now about our heritage, about Mom's family and their stories. Tom's grandfather is teaching us both the old ways, the things our ancestors knew about this land and its secrets. I still work as a ranger, still find lost hikers, but I pay more attention to the dust now. We all do. And on really hot days, when the wind is still and the temperature climbs above 130 Do4F, we stay inside. Because sometimes, if you look really carefully at the dust devils spinning across Death Valley, you can see shapes in them, walking shapes. The seal is stronger now, thanks to whatever power runs in my family's blood, but I know it won't last forever. Nothing does out here in the desert. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I look at my scarred palm and wonder, when the red time comes again, will someone else remember the old stories? Will they know what to do? Sarah says we'll be ready. She's probably right. She's smart like her mom that way. But just in case, we've started writing things down. The stories, the symbols, the warnings, everything that happened that summer. Because out here in Death Valley, the oldest stories are usually true, and the hungriest spirits are always the most patient. My name is Robert Hawkins, and this is my story. If you are reading this and you see red dust moving against the wind, run. Run fast. And remember, some seals can be broken, but love? Love is the strongest seal of all. My name is Catherine Mitchell, but everyone calls me Kate. This happened to me back in 2019, when I was working as a ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington. I've been trying to write this down for years, but every time I pick up a pen, my hand starts shaking. Even now, I keep checking to make sure my shadow is still there, still attached to me where it should be. I guess I should tell you about myself first. I used to work in search and rescue before becoming a park ranger. I was good at my job, really good. I could track missing hikers through the worst storms and find lost kids in the deepest parts of the forest. But everything changed after my partner Mike disappeared during a routine patrol. They never found him. Just his ranger hat, sitting in the middle of a clearing like he'd vanished into thin air. That's when my insomnia started. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what happened to him. The doctors gave me pills, but I didn't take them. Something in my gut told me I needed to stay alert, to keep watching. Funny how being unable to sleep ended up saving my life. I also loved taking pictures. Had my dad's old camera with me everywhere I went. The other rangers used to tease me about it, saying I should have been a photographer instead of a ranger. If they only knew how important that camera would become. It all started on a foggy Tuesday morning in October. The kind of fog that's so thick you can barely see your hand in front of your face. We got a call about a weird campsite someone had found. Tents still up, food still warm on the portable stove, but no people. Just another missing persons case, I thought. I'd handled dozens of those before. I was so wrong. When I got to the campsite, everything looked normal at first. 3 tents, a campfire that had burned down to ashes, some camping chairs scattered around. But something felt off. It took me a few minutes to figure out what it was, and when I did, my blood ran cold. Nothing was casting a shadow. Not the tents, not the trees, not even the camping chairs. It was like someone had taken an eraser and rubbed out all the darkness from the ground. That was just the beginning of what we started calling the long dark. And trust me, what came after was so much worse. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures of the campsite. It's something I always do, helps me notice details I might miss otherwise. Everything seemed normal through the lens at first, but when I checked the photos on my camera's screen, my hands started trembling. In every single picture, the shadows were there, but they were pointing in the wrong direction, like the sun was shining from 3 different places at once. I called it in, and within an hour, we found the campers. They were just sitting there in a small clearing about half a mile away. All 3 of them, staring into space with blank eyes. They were breathing, but it was like nobody was home inside their heads. And just like at their campsite, they didn't have any shadows. Not even a tiny one. The weird thing was, their cameras had pictures too. Recent ones, from just before whatever happened to them. In one photo, you could see a shadow stretching away from a tree, but it wasn't connected to the tree anymore. It looked like it was trying to crawl away. In another, there was something standing between 2 trees. Something tall and dark, made up of what looked like dozens of tangled shadows. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone had messed with the photos. Maybe the campers had taken some kind of drug that made them zone out. But deep down, I knew better. I'd been working in these woods for years, and I'd never seen anything like this. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not that I ever could anyway. I sat at my desk in the ranger station, going through the photos again and again. Around 3 a.m., I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In the last photo taken on one of the campers' phones, there were these strange symbols in the background. They looked like they were made of twisted shadows, and they seemed to move slightly when you weren't looking directly at them. I printed the photo and pinned it to my board. Big mistake. Because when I woke up from accidentally dozing off at my desk, I saw something that made my heart stop. The shadows in the photo had definitely moved. And worse, they were starting to leak out of the paper. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that night. Who would believe me? Instead, I started doing research on my own. First, I checked our records of missing persons in the park. What I found gave me chills. In the past year alone, we'd had 5 other cases where people were found in the same state as those campers, alive but empty inside, like shells without their shadows. The strange thing was, all these cases happened in the oldest part of the forest, where the trees are so tall and thick that it's like twilight even at noon. It's also where the local tribes refuse to go at night, according to the history books I found in our library. They called it the place where shadows walk. I decided to visit one of the tribal elders who lived nearby. Her name was Sarah, and she'd helped us with search and rescue operations before. When I showed her the photos, her face went pale. "They're back," she whispered. "The shadow stitchers." According to Sarah, these things had been in the forest for centuries. They weren't ghosts or monsters exactly. They were something that lived in the space between light and dark. They could take your shadow, and with it, your memories and consciousness. The tribes had ways to keep them away, but those secrets were mostly lost now. The next day, I went back to the old-growth forest with my camera. I know, probably not the smartest idea, but I had to know more. The fog was thick as soup, and my compass was going crazy, spinning in circles. Even my phone's GPS showed me being in 5 different places at once. That's when I saw it, a tree, with its shadow pointing straight up, defying gravity. I took a picture, and through my camera's screen, I saw something that made my breath catch. There was a door in the darkness between the trees. Not a regular door, but a rectangle of pure black, darker than any shadow should be. As I watched, something started coming through that door. It looked like it was made of living darkness, like someone had taken a bunch of shadows and twisted them together into a human shape. It moved in a way that hurt my eyes, like it was folding through space instead of walking. I must have made some small sound, because it turned toward me. Where its face should have been, there were just more twisted shadows, arranged in those same strange symbols I'd seen in the photos. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. But when I got back to my truck and looked at the pictures on my camera, I realized something that made my blood freeze. In each photo, the shadow creature was closer to me than it had actually been when I took the picture. It had been using my own photos to follow me home. That night, I noticed my shadow wasn't moving quite right. When I lifted my arm, my shadow was a split second too slow, like it was trying to pull away from me. I stayed up all night with every light in my house turned on. The next morning, I went to my boss, Rick, and showed him everything I'd found. At first, he looked at me like I was crazy, but then I showed him the moving photos. His face went white when he saw his own shadow flicker under the fluorescent lights. "We need a team on this," he said. "Whatever's happening, it's getting worse." He was right. That same day, we got 3 more calls about strange sightings in the park. One hiker said she saw her friend's shadow stand up and walk away. Another reported trees whose shadows bent the wrong way, creating dark tunnels in the air. But the worst was what happened to Jake, one of our newest rangers. We found him inside one of the oldest trees in the park. Not next to it, inside it. Like he'd somehow been pushed through the bark. He was still breathing, but just like the others, his shadow was gone. And his eyes. His eyes were completely black, like looking into empty space. The rescue team took tons of pictures for evidence. Big mistake. That night, when we were reviewing them in the ranger station, the shadows started leaking from every single photo. They crept across the walls like spilled ink, forming those weird symbols again. And in the darkness between the symbols, I swear I could see faces. The faces of everyone who'd lost their shadows. But the photos showed us something else too, something important. In every picture where the shadow creatures appeared, they seemed to flinch away from camera flashes. The bright light didn't hurt them exactly, but it seemed to freeze them somehow, like the light was trapping their image, just for a second. That's when I remembered something Sarah had told me. They steal memories through shadows. They take what makes us who we are. I started thinking about Mike, my old partner, about how they never found his body, about how his hat had been sitting in a patch of strange darkness when they found it. Had he discovered all this too? Had he gotten too close? I knew I had to go back to that old part of the forest, but this time, I had a plan. I grabbed every camera I could find, plus all the flash units in the station. If these things could steal shadows, maybe we could steal them back with light. Rick tried to stop me. "Kate, this is insane. We need to close the park, call in the authorities." But I knew better. By the time any authorities showed up, the shadow stitchers would just hide again, waiting for their next chance. And I couldn't let what happened to Mike happen to anyone else. What I didn't know then was that the shadow stitchers were already several steps ahead of me. They'd been watching through every shadow, listening through every dark corner, and they had something special planned for me in the heart of that ancient forest. I waited until dusk to go back in. I had 6 cameras hanging around my neck and a bag full of flash units. My hands were shaking as I walked deeper into the woods, but I kept going. The trees seemed to grow taller and older with each step, their branches blocking out what little light was left in the sky. That's when I found it, a clearing I'd never seen before. And in that clearing was the most horrible thing I've ever seen. It was like a garden, but instead of flowers, there were shadows. Hundreds of them, all stretched out and pinned to the ground like butterflies in a collection. Some looked like people, others like animals, and some I couldn't even describe. They were all moving slightly, like they were trying to break free. And in the middle of it all was a shadow that I recognized instantly. It was Mike's. His shadow was still alive, still struggling after all this time. I raised my camera to take a picture, but before I could, every shadow in the garden suddenly went still. The air got colder, and the darkness between the trees began to move. They were coming. The shadow stitchers emerged from every direction. They looked different now. Bigger, more confident. Their bodies were made up of all the shadows they'd stolen, twisted together like dark threads in a horrible tapestry. I could see faces forming and dissolving in their bodies, mouths opening in silent screams. "You've been expected," they said, but not with voices. The words appeared in my head, cold and sharp like icicles. "We've been watching you, Catherine Mitchell. Your shadow has such beautiful memories." I started taking pictures as fast as I could, the flash units going off like lightning. Each flash seemed to freeze them for a second, making them shriek in that awful silent way. But there were too many of them, and they were getting closer. Then something strange happened. In my camera's screen, I could see more than just the shadow stitchers. I could see the boundaries between light and dark, the doors they used to travel. And behind those doors, I saw where all the stolen shadows went. That's when I remembered the old camera hanging around my neck, my dad's camera, the one I'd had since I was a kid, the one that had captured thousands of happy memories. I had an idea, but I knew it was probably going to be the last photo I ever took. The ground under my feet started to shake. All around the clearing, the ancient burial grounds were coming alive. Shadows of people who had died hundreds of years ago were rising up, called by the shadow stitchers. Time itself felt wrong. I saw flashes of the past and present all mixed together. My own shadow was pulling away from me now, stretching toward the shadow stitchers like a rubber band about to snap. The cold in my head got worse as they tried to steal my memories. I saw my childhood home, my first day as a ranger, Mike's face, all of it starting to fade like old photographs. But they'd made one big mistake. They were so busy trying to take my shadow that they didn't notice what I was doing with my dad's camera. You see, this camera was special, not because it had any magic powers, but because it held 30 years of memories. Happy memories. Real memories. Every birthday, every holiday, every beautiful sunset I'd ever shared with someone I loved. I pointed the camera at the largest shadow stitcher and pressed the button. But instead of taking a picture, I opened the back of the camera. The film inside was instantly exposed to light, and 30 years of memories came flooding out all at once. The burst of light was like a small sun. Every photo I'd ever taken with that camera flashed into the darkness at once. The shadow stitchers screamed, and this time I could hear it. They tried to escape through their dark doorways, but the light followed them. It was like the memories in those photos were fighting back against their stolen shadows. The shadow garden erupted. Every trapped shadow broke free at once, racing back to find their owners. I saw Mike's shadow disappear into the darkness, and I like to think it found its way back to him, wherever he was. When it was all over, I was alone in the clearing. The shadow stitchers were gone, but not destroyed. I could still feel them out there, hiding in the spaces between light and dark. My own shadow was back, but it was different. Like part of it was still connected to their world. They closed that section of the park after what happened, said it was because of unsafe ground conditions. But I know the real reason. Sometimes, late at night, I still see those symbols forming in the shadows on my wall, and every photo I take now shows a little bit more darkness than it should. I never found Mike. But sometimes when I develop my photos in the darkroom, I see his shadow moving in the background. He's trying to tell me something, I think. Warning me that the shadow stitchers are still out there, still hungry, still waiting. And the scariest part? Those photos I took of them that night. They've started showing up on the internet. People share them, thinking they're just creepy pictures. But every time someone looks at those photos, the shadows in them grow a little stronger, stretch a little further. So if you are reading this, be careful of what you photograph. And always, always check to make sure your shadow is still following you the way it should. Because the shadow stitchers are patient and they're learning to spread through every dark corner, every shadowy image, every scary story shared in the dark. Just like this one.